Alrighty, so this topic is going to be regarding survey administration. So once you pre-test your draft of your survey, you format it in a way that is, like we talked about in the previous lecture, that's accurate, that has good questions that are actually getting to the concepts that you would like. Once you have that final draft of your survey drafted up, the next step is, okay, how do I get respondents to respond to the survey? And there are a couple of ways in which we do that. So there's home delivered surveys where someone may come and have a survey form, or they may be doing an in-person survey and they knock on people's door and ask them if they would like to participate in a survey. And so this maybe is less common than it used to be. But the most common one is mailed surveys. I just got a mailed survey like a couple months ago where they sent me a form and then they gave me like $5 and said if I filled out the form, they would send another $5. So sometimes, and we'll get into this in this lecture, there are ways that you can incentivize people to do the survey. And there's also telephone surveys. So I'm currently participating in this study where we're calling people who were released post-COVID from prison. And so I call them up and ask them if they have time to do the survey, say that they'll be compensated for their time, which often provides incentives. And so I have some structured questions that I ask them and they answer, and I either record their answers or I'll do a transcription of it. So telephone surveys are pretty common, and the questions are answered in real time. Then there's online surveys, which are more self-administered. So the person gets the website and fills out the survey, or the survey is emailed to them. And so sometimes we can combine some of these administrative strategies. So we might go to someone's home and provide them with a website. Like, for example, the census this past year, they came to my home and they gave me the website for the census. And they also gave me a form for the census if I wanted to mail it. So sometimes we can sort of merge these types of administering surveys to get a better response rate. There's also in-person surveys. So you may do this if you're in providing social services and social work and you are trying to survey the people that you provide services to. So you may do that in person prior to them getting services, and then post after they got services. So a big part of survey administration is your response rate. So as we talked about, there's the sampling frame, which tries to measure, okay, what's the larger population I'm interested in and who are the people that I'm going to contact. And then from that is a smaller portion, usually of people who actually respond to your survey, right? Because we need to be realistic and know that not everyone is going to respond to our survey. And so especially if we're keeping the anonymity of people who are filling out the survey, then we really need to have some type of method of keeping track of how many responses we get out of all the responses we sent. So often we'll put serial numbers on the form so we can check off, okay, we got this form back in the mail. Here it is checked off, so you can tally up what your response rate is. Because there's going to be some selection issues, that there may be people who are more likely to respond to a survey. For example, people who have more time on their hands, less people who are not balancing multiple jobs may be more likely to fill out a survey. And so sometimes what we can do is do follow-up mailings or follow-up correspondence via email and say, like, please fill out the survey again. And these, you need to think about the timing of them to make sure that they're actually incentivizing people to fill out the survey and not decentivizing people. So your book argues that acceptable response rates are 50% is adequate, 60% is good, and 70% is very good. And something we need to balance with the response rate is how well people answer the actual survey. So you could have a very large response rate, but people are just like moving through the survey. So that's definitely something to consider when we're administering surveys, and to really be transparent in the methods portion of whatever article you're writing up about it in regards to any response bias that may have occurred. So there's some supplementary survey response materials that we might send or email or whatever way we're administering the survey. But some of them are like cover letters. So they provide background information and context of why the survey is being conducted, why a respondent was selected, why it's important to complete the questionnaire, and what the institutional affiliation is. So usually when you're filling out an IRB to do something like this, the IRB will ask you to formulate a cover letter to determine whether or not you're being transparent enough in saying what the risks and the benefits are in being able to be in the study. There also may be warning mailings, like you're sort of giving people pre-notification that they're gonna get a questionnaire in the mail, or you may ask them to make sure that the address that they have for the person that they're trying to get to fill out the survey is right. And so warning mailings are sort of used as cleaning the addresses, and they can be more effective than postcards in increasing response rates. So online surveys are pretty common. And so they often are self-administered. So the person is the one filling it out, typing in their answers, clicking on the options that is most relevant to them. And so there's some advantages, like you can use really easy tools that have already been developed, like SurveyMonkey and Google Forms. Like the way I surveyed y'all for this class was to use Google Forms. That was really easy because it gives me an Excel document of all your answers. And then there's also Mechanical Turk, which is like Amazon has become sort of this mediator between people who want to administer surveys, and then there are people who sign up to actually answer those surveys and get paid to. So it's a good space where you can test questions, like do pre-testing, but it might be better to do a larger scale survey administration rather than depending on a third-party provider, because there could be some selection, especially in Mechanical Turk, of who's more likely to get signed up to do that. And so some issues then come with representativeness. So if we're trying to identify people who are in poverty or trying to understand poverty in relation to crime, it might be difficult to get the population frame we would like, because there is most likely an association between poverty and people having internet access and easy computer access, right? And also when we're like in this technological world where we're super inundated with tons of emails, these surveys might just get lost in the shuffle, and we would maybe have like a really low response rate. And then there's the issue of the people actually taking the survey, their response bias, and whether or not they're actually being truthful in how they're answering. And because the administration of surveys online is more visual, because the person gets to visually see what it looks like, it's really important to make sure that the way that it's formatted is appealing. So you want to have good contrast, and you also want to make sure that like the more interesting or positive questions are at the top. In-person surveys often achieve higher response rates than mail surveys. And so when you're thinking about in-person surveys, something that you need to actually think about that could affect the reliability and validity of your results is the appearance of the interviewer, and like how the interviewer develops a rapport or a connection with the person they're interviewing. And so the interviewer should be familiar with the questionnaire and ask questions precisely. There's a difference in surveys between semi-structured and structured surveys. So semi-structured may be more of an open sense of how you would answer questions. So like we said, the open-ended questions are more semi-structured. So if you have a list of questions you need to get to, you may have a more conversational setting with the person you're interviewing rather than going through a list of questions like in exact form, because maybe they'll get to the question you're asking sooner or later, and you sort of want to have them have more of a space to talk. And so when there's more than one interviewer, you really need to be on the same page, or else it could get confusing or the interviewee can get frustrated. And so you really need to practice interviewing to ensure that you're actually getting reliable and valid answers from the surveyor. So there's computer assisted interviews, which are often when, for example, like an interviewer will read a question from a screen and type the answers to the respondents. So like, for example, if you go to an interview, sometimes they'll ask you a bunch of questions and they're typing the answers. That's a computer assisted interview. And then there's computer assisted self-interviewing, which allows the respondent to sort of answer themselves, and you provide them with a tablet or a computer and they're the ones inputting their answers. But sometimes the answers are scrambled, so that way if there's multiple people taking the survey at the same time, they're not trying to like be consistent in their answers. And so these really help with confidentiality because you can ensure that the data you're collecting on the computer is anonymous and like sort of have a hand checklist that's separate from that on who is getting interviewed. And so it's pretty helpful because it ensures the accuracy of your responses because people are typing in the questions or they're being typed. And it helps in administering interviews in general and surveys in general. Then there's also computer assisted telephone interviewing, which is a bit different than these, which is when there is someone who's on the phone and they're asking you questions and they're using a computer to collect the data. So there's actually companies that do this and it's pretty accurate, but it's more expensive. And there is also like a sense of it's easier for people to, if there's a contingency question like we talked about earlier of, okay, whether or not you are incarcerated, then the person who's doing the phone interview doesn't need to let the person know that they're not getting questions. They will just move on to the next thing. Whereas someone who is filling out the survey like via paper might get confused and answer questions that may have not been relevant to them. So telephone surveys are used to be like really common for research science, and they were really convenient because you could do random digit dialing, so you can make sure that the sampling frame that you have is actually random and that you can make causal statements and get to the sampling frame and not have any bias for how you're selecting the people who are going to be in your survey. And it's helpful because there's a sense of being able to get the data, but you don't need to be in a space in a particular time. Like during COVID, it's more dangerous to be outside and to be engaging with people face to face. So oftentimes telephone interviewing can help in situations like that. There's issues because especially we know in New Jersey and in other parts of the US, there's like a lot of robocalls and spammers. And so people are just less likely to answer their phone. They're also less likely to have a home phone line. So usually home phone lines are attached to a zip code, and therefore we can have a sense of the context and geography of the people that we're interviewing when we're using landlines. But recently cell phones have sort of made that obsolete. That's not really what happens anymore. And so we're calling a lot of people on their cell phones, but we don't know if that cell phone is connected still, and where that person is living. They could, like, for example, I have a 773 number, but I don't live in Chicago, and that's the Chicago area code, and I'm in New Jersey. So there's no sort of triangulation of where people are. And random digit dialing, because landlines are so reduced, are often we're going to get businesses, payphones, or fax lines, which may not be applicable to the study we're interested in. So 95, and we also need to think about the people who don't have cell phones. So 95, or telephones in general, 95.5% of all households in 2005 had telephones in general. So there are benefits and there are drawbacks to doing telephone surveys, and like anything else in research methods, we need to balance it and we need to think about it depending on our research question. So you can think for yourself about a research question you have and think about what might be the best way to do something like that. If having residential, owning a home is really important for your survey, like if that's a population that is the larger population parameter you're considering, then it's important to do home delivered surveys, or to go in person to a person's home to make sure that they are homeowners. Or you could do it via mail if you feel like there's a way that you can access a larger list of people who do own homes. And so there are so many different ways that you could administer a survey, and it really comes down to expense and the type of question you're looking for and the sampling frame that you're considering. So there's a lot of companies that do surveys, and we'll get more into specific types of surveys that are very common in the next lecture. But like I said, you really need to consider up the costs, because often surveys are cost intensive, especially if you're doing in-person interviews. You have to pay your interviewees for their hourly work. If you're doing phone interviews, you need to pay them in that way too. And so you need to not only pay people, but you need to train them. And this can be really time consuming and not inexpensive. And like I said, as always, your method depends on your question and how you're trying to sample. So always, there's no bad research method, there's no good research method. It really depends on the context of your question and the population that you're trying to sample from.